Good evening, and it's a great pleasure for me to share this afternoon with you in this beautiful library. It takes me back to my Cambridge years, and you know, when I was walking through the hall, I think it's called Healy Hall, yeah, it really kind of reminded me both of my years in Ganden Monastery as a Buddhist monk, but also my years as a student at Cambridge. So it gives me great pleasure to be with you here today, and I would like to first of all express my deep appreciation to the theology department and also Berkeley Center for inviting me to participate in this lecture series called Buddhism and Science. I would also like to personally thank Dr. Bogan for insisting on me being part of this very interesting conversation. Generally, when I have had the chance to participate in academic talks, we expect a much smaller audience. But today, maybe the fact that perhaps the topic is Buddhism and science dialogue, maybe the level of interest among the public is much higher. Anyway, to do justice to the fact that I've been brought over from Canada to here, and this time I at least made the effort to try to put my thoughts down on a piece of paper so that my thoughts would be more structured. As Dr. Bogan pointed out, I've had the privilege to serve His Holiness the Dalai Lama in my capacity as his principal translator for now almost a quarter of a century. My hair is almost completely grey in the front. I have also had the honor in that capacity to be an observer at many of his dialogues with scientists over a period of now many years. And also as someone whose primary education took place within the classical Tibetan monastic education, and I cherish the Tibetan tradition very much, particularly its intellectual tradition, which has a very long history. And so from a very early stage in my student years at Ganden, because I happened to be one of the very few odd individual monks in these monasteries who happened to master English language. So my interest was quite ecumenical. So one thing that from a very early stage I started taking great interest in is the question of Buddhist intellectual traditions encounter with worldviews other than itself. And also I was, of course, through my reading, conscious of the Buddhist traditions in other Asian countries like Sri Lanka, particularly, and in Japan and China, in their encounter with modernity and the scientific worldview which comes along with the coming of modernity. So in the case of Tibetan tradition, of course, because of the political tragedy of 1950s, as an intellectual tradition and as a tradition itself, Tibet did not have the opportunity to encounter modernity in its own terms. However, since a large segment of the population are based in exiled community in India, where much of the classical heritage is kind of handled and carried on by the monastic communities. In the end, for the Tibetan Buddhist tradition to really engage with modernity and particularly the scientific worldview, the main responsibility will have to be shouldered by the monastic community, because it represents they are the custodians of the intellectual tradition. So as a monk, this whole question of how should the Tibetan Buddhist tradition engage with a scientific worldview has been an object of personal interest for me as well, partly for reasons of our own survival of the tradition. So with that those preliminary words, I will read from the prepared text so that my thought will have a greater structure. On the stage of religion and science dialogue, Buddhism is a late comer, and within Buddhism, the Tibetan tradition is definitely a late arrival. Recent scholarship, especially of Donald Lopez, our previous speaker in the series, has drawn attention to the historical context of the origins of this dialogue, especially the assertion that Buddhism is the most scientific religion. Research demonstrates that such claims are a product of a colonial encounter, as Buddhist leaders in Sri Lanka, China, and Japan sought to rebut the accusation that Buddhism was a form of superstition. Lopez's work also calls for the need to be sensitive to the changing characterization of what Buddhism and what science we are talking about when we speak of Buddhism and science encounter. My focus today is on the current ongoing dialogue between Buddhism and science. Here too, we need to appreciate the complexity of the phenomenon. For example, there are the scientists whose relationship to their dialogue partner Buddhism may differ in terms of their degrees. For example, you have scientists who are interested in engaging with Buddhism to expand their horizons. Then you have some scientists who are themselves Buddhists and seek to integrate their scientific worldview with that of Buddhism. So in this last category, you have people like the late Francisco Varela, the late physicist Victor Mansfield, and so on. Then, of course, you have the Buddhist world, within which, again, there are two quite different Buddhist representations. For example, on the one side, we have what might be called traditional Buddhist voice, such as that of Tibetan Buddhism, and then there is the voice of the Western Buddhist. So when I refer to Tibetan tradition as traditional Buddhist voice, I'm not contrasting traditional versus progressive. I'm using the word traditional in the sense these are societies where Buddhism is their inherited intellectual tradition. So briefly put, where the two are coming from, although each may claim to represent the voice of Buddhism in the dialogue, may be quite different. So briefly put, the traditional Buddhists come to the dialogue with Buddhist worldview as their inherited intellectual tradition, while the Western Buddhists come to the conversation with the scientific worldview as their inherited intellectual tradition. Clearly, this difference will impact the motivation, the purpose, and the conception of the nature of dialogue encountered between Buddhism and science. In my talk today, I shall focus primarily on the traditional Buddhist perspective, so in the sense I'm using, not as contrasting to progressive, especially that of my own Tibetan tradition as it engages with science and its dominant worldview. Tibet being a latecomer on the scene of modernity, we did not feel the need to engage with science and the scientific worldview for a long time. It was only in the 1930s when the brilliant Tibetan scholar Gyaltsen Chögyal went on a 12-year journey which took him through British India as well as Sri Lanka, the Tibetan tradition finally came to encounter modern science. Towards the end of his 17-part journal, which Gyaltsen Chögyal wrote, recording his observations and experience, he composed a plea to his fellow Tibetan thinkers in which he called for an urgent need to engage with modern science, if nothing else, for the sake of the survival of our own cherished Buddhist faith. I shall not go into the details of Gyaltsen Chögyal's letter and its subsequent history. Interestingly, even at this very early stage, the author insightfully identifies 4 specific areas where there could be a fruitful encounter. 1, he singles out the modern scientific understanding of matter as dynamic, perhaps reference to Einstein's famous equation, as providing a powerful confirmation of the fundamental Buddhist insight into anitya, the ever-fluctuating, impermanent nature of things. 2, another area where he sees a striking convergence is in the concept of relativity. Here he draws attention particularly to the Nagarjuna's thought, where, according to which all notions of absolute, whether it is of time, matter, consciousness, and so on, are rejected, and where everything, both in terms of their existence and even their identity, is understood within the framework of utter contingency, of interconnected network of relationships. So this is the philosophy of emptiness, shunyata. Third area where Gyaltsen Chögyal identifies a special focus is the modern scientific insight into how our perceptions of the world is determined by our sensory faculties and the representations they produce. This he takes to entail the rejection of any naive standpoint that somehow our perception objectively mirrors reality. In delving into this theme, Geshe Thupten brings the sophisticated epistemology of Dignaga and Dharmakirti into contact with the scientific world, scientific views. Finally, the author briefly observes what he sees as striking parallels between the neurobiological understanding of the human body with the human physiology found in the Vajrayana Buddhist texts. So he identifies these four areas. Unfortunately, Geshe Thupten's letter never received the attention it deserved. In fact, it only came to be published or printed in more than 4 decades after its composition. It sort of seems to have disappeared. However, for our understanding of the nature and scope of the current ongoing dialogue between Tibetan Buddhism and modern science, Geshe Thupten's initial observations can prove quite insightful. Already at this very early stage, Geshe Thupten intuits the most fruitful areas where there could be a dialogue between Buddhism and science. What Geshe Thupten brings to this dialogue from science is its empirical observations and the outcomes based on these observations that may have direct resonance within the Buddhist thought. And what he omits from the list is as much telling as what he includes. For example, nowhere does he bring the Buddhist Abhidharma cosmology into the picture, nor does he look at the materialist assumptions of the scientific conception of mental phenomena. So you can see that already at that very early stage, Geshe Thupten has quite a circumcised kind of parameters of the encounter between Buddhism and science. Interestingly, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's engagement with science proceeds according to a strikingly similar pathway, even though the Dalai Lama came across Geshe Thupten's letter only in the 1980s, when his own dialogue with scientists was already in its 2nd decade. Thanks to the Dalai Lama's personal enthusiasm for science, today interest in modern science is attracting unprecedented prominence and seriousness within the Tibetan monastic circles, especially among the younger generation. Formal science education is now on its way to becoming incorporated into the standard curriculum of the monastic institutions. The Dalai Lama's dialogue with scientists has also led to the development of an intellectual discourse where Buddhist scholars engage in ongoing conversations with scientists from a wide range of disciplines, including quantum physics, neuroscience, and psychology. Perhaps the most promising field has so far been neuroscience, where today rigorous experiments involve Buddhist monks, not simply experimental subjects, but some taking active role in the actual designing of the experimental protocols, as well as expanding the conceptual frameworks within which to examine and understand and interpret the mental phenomena. Some even speak of emergence of a new field called contemplative science, quote unquote, or in the words of a recent, Wall Street Journal author, neural Buddhism. But that might be. Now the question is, what does the Tibetan participation bring into this dialogue? The Dalai Lama often points out that the Tibetan Buddhism sees itself as continuing the heritage of Indian Nalanda tradition. This is a classical tradition that emphasizes the combination of rigorous philosophical inquiry based on application of reason and argumentation, as well as deep reflection on the interrelationship of concepts. Also, contemplative inquiry into the phenomenology of the meditative states, as well as the embracing of altruistic ethics, the Bodhisattva ID of Mahayana tradition. From a historical point of view, just as modern science brings to its understanding of the world the rich heritage of the Greek rational thought, especially what was once known as natural philosophy, Tibetan Buddhism brings to its understanding the long history of ideas within the classical Buddhist thought, developed and refined over a period of more than 2,000 years. First in India, then later in Tibet. Broadly characterized, the Tibetan Buddhist thought can be seen as integration of the following key elements of classical Buddhist tradition. So you have, on the one side, you have the inherited tradition of early Buddhist emphasis on understanding the mechanism that underlie reality, where the principle of causality is really taken to be the most fundamental, particularly the way in which it is understood as the principle of dependent origination. So this is one very important kind of aspect of the Tibetan tradition. The other important tradition aspect is its non-essentialist ontology, which is inherited from the Mahayana Nagarjuna's tradition, where there is a deep reluctance to posit any notion of absolute. So, and where the emphasis is on understanding whatever phenomena that is being examined, in terms of a network interrelationship, rather than things and events possessing self-enclosed kind of realities of their own. So this ontology, non-essentialist ontology, is another important part of the tradition. A third important element is the epistemology of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, which flourished in India around 6th and 7th century onwards, where many of the questions that are examined in Western philosophy, for example, the concept, the theory of knowledge, the relationship between belief and reality, the nature of perception, and the role language plays in the construction of our understanding of reality. These are again part of a very important kind of Indian philosophical tradition that, although developed with the writings of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, but that had a very interesting interface with non-Buddhist Vaisheshika and Nyayika traditions as well. So it is these that the Tibetans have inherited. Similarly, Tibetans have inherited what is known as the Abhidhamma tradition. And for the purpose of this lecture, we can broadly characterize it as Buddhist version of psychology and phenomenology, where in contrast to epistemology, which tends to be more philosophical and analytical, Abhidhamma kind of approach to understanding mental phenomena is more experiential and phenomenological, and using primarily introspection as a key element of its method, and then analyzing the content of that meditative state. So Abhidhamma, again, is a very important part of the inherited tradition. Then, of course, in addition to all of this, then there is the Vajrayana tradition. So what we see is that when someone like His Holiness, participates in a dialogue, he is bringing all of this as his inherited kind of, intellectual tradition at the table. So this is the kind of the uniqueness of the Tibetan tradition, because it sees itself as the continuation of the Nalanda tradition. So there is this much greater integrated approach where ontology, epistemology, ethics, they're all seen as part of a greater integrated kind of tradition. Now, what then is the nature and scope of the current ongoing dialogue between Buddhism and science? Now, there is no doubt that it is the Dalai Lama's personal enthusiasm for engaging with science that has been instrumental in the renewed vitality we see in the conversation between Buddhism and science today. The story of how the Dalai Lama came to be interested in science and how over the last several decades he has reflected deeply on how science intersects with his own inherited Buddhist worldview is told beautifully in his recent work, The Universe in a Single Atom. To give a flavor of this enthusiasm, let me quote briefly from an early part of the book. I quote, "Although my own interest in science began with curiosity about a world foreign to me at that time, governed by technology, it was not very long before the colossal significance of science for humanity as a whole dawned on me, especially after I came into exile in 1959. There is no area of human life today that is not touched by the effects of science and technology. Yet, are we clear about the place of science in the totality of human life? What exactly it should do and by what it should be governed?" Unquote. Even in this short paragraph, we can see a powerful influence of the Dalai Lama's own inherited Buddhist tradition. There is, first of all, the appreciation of the observable effects of science on human life. This reflects powerfully Buddhist emphasis on the primacy of empirical evidence. Second, there is the philosophical challenge posed to the question of the scope and limits of scientific knowledge. In other words, the question is raised as to whether science is the only legitimate source of knowledge, thus the only constitutive element of our understanding of the world and human condition. Finally, there is the powerful question on the relationship between science and ethics, which raises the question of the motivation behind science and technology. A careful observation of the Dalai Lama's dialogue with science reveals a creative and a sophisticated approach. One can discern two aspects to this. Now here I'm kind of, interpreting His Holiness, so it's not him who is saying there are these two parts. One is the dialogue. This is one of the problems I have with my very close service for His Holiness over so many years. Sometimes I have to make sure that when I'm interpreting the Dalai Lama, people don't take it that that's how he presents it. One can discern two aspects to this. One is the dialogue with scientists on specific topics of mutual interest and concern. Interest and concern that are mutually shared by both Buddhists and scientists. Say, for example, the understanding of human emotions or the epistemological challenges posed by new discoveries in quantum physics and so on. So these are topics which are of common interest and common concern. The second is Buddhism's engagement with the scientific worldview. Now here, there really is engagement at the level of ideas in the worldview, which may entail, for example, incorporation of specific scientific concepts into the Buddhist worldview as part of its updating of the understanding of the physical and the mental world. It seems that the Dalai Lama sees this second type of dialogue to be primarily relevant for the traditionally Buddhist societies, something they will have to embrace as they move ever closer towards full encounter with modernity. So you can see that, as I interpret it, there are two aspects to this dialogue. One is dialogues between scientists and Buddhists, on topics that are of mutual interest and concern. The other one is Buddhism's engagement with scientific worldview at the level of ideas. And he seems to think that the second type of dialogue is really relevant more for the Buddhist societies. In the context of the first type of dialogue, that is on the specific topics of mutual interest and concern, there is the recognition of both Buddhism and science as representing two different investigative traditions, both in a quest for gaining a deeper understanding of reality. Here, the project can be seen as kind of a collaborative one, that is to help further human knowledge and through this way seek ways to contribute towards the betterment of the world. On this level, the key elements that are brought on the table, both from Buddhism and science, are those that lend themselves to empirical method, and where necessary, the theoretical aspects that are critical for the interpretation of the empirical data that are brought to bear as well. On this level of dialogue, what one might call the metaphysical dimensions, such as the concept of rebirth, karma, and the possibility of full enlightenment of Buddhism from the Buddhism, and physicalism, reductionism, and closure principle on the part of the scientific worldview, these are kind of left bracketed. Now, these operating principles have been salient in the influential Mind and Life dialogues, which began in 1987 in India and have been continuing ever since, a series that have brought together scientists in conversation with Buddhist thinkers, especially the Dalai Lama. And there's going to be a Mind and Life here in October, focused on education. So I've had the honor to be part of these dialogues right from its inception. So let me, as it were, from an insider's perspective, say a few words on how the nature and the scope of these dialogues have been conceived and understood. Now, right from the beginning of these Mind and Life dialogues, the key people behind initiating these dialogues, a careful thought has been given to the nature of the relationship between Buddhism and science, the two partners in the dialogue. And one very important aspect of this has been the emphasis that both on the part of Buddhism and part of science, both partners should avoid any hegemonic tendency to try to reduce the discourse of the other into one's own framework. There also needs to be a degree of openness on the both sides, that a legitimate source of knowledge might be found in an investigative tradition that does not share your own history. Of course, in this conversation, when it comes to actual scientific questions, of course, science has the upper hand. But still, a careful attention was paid to really organize the operating principles in such a way so that on the part of the scientist, they avoid the naive assumption that somehow science is now coming to analyze Buddhism. So that the role of Buddhism becomes just a subject. So this was, and this is quite important. For example, before we have actual dialogue with His Holiness, because every 2 years, the more informal, in-depth discussions take place at his residence in Dharamsala. And before we bring the scientists to Dharamsala, we spent 2 days together in the States somewhere, where we have a kind of a rehearsal, a pre-conference. And one of my roles had been to kind of give an orientation, presentation to really try to kind of create the atmosphere and what are the expectations on the part of the Buddhist participation at this dialogue. And I remember once, and I'm not going to name the scientist, there was one quite a well-known scientist, and he said that this all sounds very politically correct and nice, but he said the fact remains that, for example, why should we take Buddhist interpretation of a phenomena seriously? He said, let me give you an example. If there is a virtuoso baseball player and he can hit the ball in a way that nobody can, of course, as an athlete, we will admire him, but we're not going to give him any privileged position to explain to us the physics of the trajectory of the ball when it hits and so on. He will have, just because he happened to hit the ball so well, doesn't give him any privileged position to explain what is going on here. He says it's the same thing with the meditative experiences that the Buddhist monks happen to have. So I then immediately, of course politely, responded that the difference here is that this is a baseball player who has a lot of understanding of physics, so that he can explain the trajectory. So my point was that when engaging with Buddhist tradition, and particularly looking at phenomena such as meditative states, you are the scientists are engaging with a tradition that has a very sophisticated intellectual and theoretical framework within which the phenomenon, at least attempt is made, real serious attempt is made to understand the phenomenon, at a given moment. So, so that's an example. So the point I'm trying to make is to really, for these kind of dialogues to succeed, there needs to be a respect on each other's parts, because otherwise the tendency would be to immediately kind of impose one's agenda on the other. So, and so the Mind Alive, one of the corrective measures that also we took from the third meeting onwards was to bring in the presence of a philosopher, because early on we realized that scientists are fantastic with what they do in their own specialized field, but when it comes to kind of a theoretical level, and particularly more at a philosophical level, there's a certain naivety sometimes, and especially when they are forced to interpret the phenomenon they understand in the context of a multiplicity of perspectives and coming from different disciplines, then you do need a philosopher. So we, from the third meeting onwards, one of the important corrective measures that we took was to always insist on having a presence of a philosopher who will be able to really ask questions about, is it your interpretation or is the data supports it? All of those critical questions. So So with these operating principles, the Mind and Life dialogues have so far covered a vast range of scientific topics, from quantum physics and astronomy to the question of brain plasticity and emotional research and neuroscience and so on. So in this kind of, encounter between two traditions, what are the challenges? Clearly there are going to be challenges, and there needs to be also a critical engagement on both parts. So earlier I suggested there is a second dimension to the Buddhism and science dialogue, which, as I interpreted, His Holiness seems to think is relevant only primarily for the Buddhist societies. In brief, the object here is twofold. One is to incorporate those elements of the scientific worldview that are essential, for which there are sound empirical bases, into the Buddhist worldview. And two is to respond to the perceived challenges being posed by the scientific worldview to the Buddhist concepts. So you can see that the first object is more of an educational, in that the concern here is to update the classical Buddhist understanding of the world. So for example, in the light of the insights of modern physics, the classical Buddhist theories about material structure and the constitution of the natural world, such as its theory of atoms, they turn out to be very outdated. And then, so the attitude here is it's a matter of simply updating, the basis that we have. Similarly, if you look at kind of, classical Buddhist text, there is, again, some discussion about the origin of the complex life forms on this earth. Again, this is an Abhidhamma text. Of course, much of the, many aspects of this narrative do not fit well with the current scientific understanding. So here, again, the important point is to incorporate a Darwinian evolutionary understanding of the arising of complex life forms from a simpler state. So in brief, so the underlying attitude is simply this, where there are empirical accounts, whether it has to do with cosmology, understanding of matter at subatomic level, or the evolution of complex life forms, whatever empirical evidence supports takes precedence. That's from the Buddhist point of view. This spirit is beautifully captured in the following, again by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I quote, "The insights of science have enriched many aspects of my own Buddhist worldview. Einstein's theory of relativity, with its vivid thought experiments, has given an empirically tested texture to my grasp of Nagarjuna's theory of relativity of time. The extraordinarily detailed picture of the behavior of subatomic particles at the minutest levels imaginable brings home the Buddha's teaching on the dynamically transient nature of all things. The discovery of the genome all of us share throws into sharp relief the Buddhist view of the fundamental equality of all human beings." Unquote. There is, however, another objective in this critical engagement with science, which, as noted earlier, has to do with responding to the perceived challenges being posed by the scientific worldview to key Buddhist concepts. For example, what is the status in this dialogue of the concept of rebirth? See? What does the closure principle, that is, universally almost assumed in science, that states that the only causes that operate are material causes? What does this principle imply for the Buddhist theory of karmic causation? How does Buddhism respond to the widely assumed regulative principle in cognitive science that mind equals the brain, that all mental states are brain states? Now here, it is worth recalling an important aspect of the history of the development of Buddhist thought in classical India. More often than not, a high point in the development of Buddhist thought in India, whether it is Nagarjuna's philosophy of emptiness in the 2nd century or Dharmakirti's epistemology in the 7th century, most of these took place within the context of critical engagement with other systems of thought other than Buddhism. So debate and refinement of views in the wake of criticism has been an integral part of the dynamics of development in the history of Buddhist thought, such that even today, course in comparative philosophy, of course those of classical India, remain part of the regular curriculum in the Tibetan monastic colleges. And to this day, as young ones, we have to study the important non-Buddhist, classical Indian philosophy such as Vaishashika, Nayayika, Samkhya, and so on. So it is in this spirit of critical engagement that the Tibetan monastic scholars tend to relate to science. Scientists who have engaged with Tibetan scholars have noticed how questions immediately turn to philosophical implications of specific scientific views, rather than focusing on the details of the content of a particular concept. Furthermore, they have also noticed how, on the whole, it is physics, especially quantum physics and the epistemological challenges it poses, that tend to immediately capture attention of the monks' scholars. What this suggests is that as the Tibetan monastic scholars come to acquire deeper understanding of science, there could emerge more sophisticated intellectual engagement with the scientific worldview. At this point, His Holiness is one of the very few exceptions. On the whole, there is a very high degree of naivety, partly because of the lack of understanding of science and its history. And part of the problem has to do with lack of available material in Tibetan language. So it's only those monks who have a facility with English can have access to some scientific material at this point. So among the monastic scholars, especially among the younger generation, although there is a tremendous enthusiasm, there is also quite a lot of naivety. People tend to be either very critical and very skeptical and arguing that nothing Buddhist tradition needs to learn from science, or the other extreme where people opt for the position that science is in a sense a latecomer, and they are slowly catching up with where Buddhism has already been more than 2,500 years ago. So what is happening now is more of a kind of fleshing out of the details, where science is kind of in a very kind of slow, like a tortoise step, proving through empirical evidence what Buddhists have known all along. So you can see that there is kind of this naivety leads to these very extreme positions. But as because the monks are brought up in this critical training through debating and stuff, as the level of scientific education becomes more kind of nuanced and richer, then I'm sure the conversation and the engagement will get much more sophisticated. And there is now, in fact, a program I've been partly involved in developing specific science curriculum for the monastic scholars, where these texts are all being produced in Tibetan language. So we'll see. It is in this area of critical engagement, primarily at the level of worldview, that the Tibetan thought can bring a set of powerful methodological and epistemological approaches. For example, one important concept in Tibetan epistemology is the recognition of three primary sources of knowledge. These are direct experience, inference, and third-person testimony. These three correlate to what the tradition refers to as the three types of facts in the world. So you have, on the one hand, evident facts, which lend themselves to direct observations. Then you have hidden but inferable facts, the facts that you can infer on the basis of what you observe. So you have to kind of make a causal link, and then you make the inference. Then you have what is referred to as the extremely hidden facts. So you can see that, where the Buddhism can hide a lot of things. So there is the recognition that not all facts lend themselves to direct empirical proof. However, it is on the basis of the empirical facts that one's understanding of the world derived from inference must be built. So it's really direct observation of the experience of the world is the basis upon which you have to then build. Thus, within the three sources of knowledge, it is direct experience that takes precedence. And in addition to these epistemological principles, what can also, call logical principles play a crucial role. For example, the Dalai Lama often invokes the critical logical distinction that must be made between that which is not proven and which is proven not to be the case. So basically, not to see is not the same as seeing not to be the case. In other words, not finding is not the same as finding it not to be the case. In order for there to be a coincidence between, now this may turn out to be kind of highbrow academic distinction, but in order for there to be a coincidence between non-observance and observance of its absence, the facts under investigation must belong to the category of evident truth, such as, for example, the presence or absence of a grizzly bear in this room. So the fact that you don't see a grizzly bear in this room isn't proof enough that it is not here. But that's because the fact under discussion is an evident fact that should be observable. So, in other words, in brief, what the Buddhist tradition does here is, first of all, to ask the question, what type of a fact is being asserted in a specific scientific claim? Is this a claim about an evident fact, or is it a claim pertaining to an inference based on that evident fact? Or is it an assertion that is part of an explanatory theoretical system? Or is it an assertion that assumes a certain regulative principle, which is itself not proven? Or is it a claim, is the claim really part of a wider worldview that assumes, among other things, standpoints of reductionism, physicalism, and so on? So the Buddhists, those who are trained in the Tibetan tradition are capable of really asking these kind of very pointed questions. Dalai Lama is famous, of course, in having made the statement that if science proves any aspect of the Buddhist views wrong, then regardless of how long we might have upheld it, we must abandon it. Though this is true, such assertions must be appreciated with the background of a developed epistemology and logical tradition. So there is a kind of an important caveat here. In reviewing the current ongoing encounter between Buddhism and science, it is perhaps useful to invoke a distinction some have made between three quite distinct ways in which Buddhists have conceived the nature of relationship between Buddhism and science. So this is primarily the work of Jose Capazon. He talks about one type of relationship where the Buddhists would see science as in terms of a conflict or ambivalence. So this is a kind of a much more skeptical standpoint. The other is see science and Buddhism as very compatible, or in some cases even identical. So there's an identity relationship. And the third one is a more sophisticated approach where they are seen more as a complementarity. So, anyone who's interested in this should read a wonderful paper that Jose contributed to a collection called Buddhism and Science, Breaking New Ground, which was edited by Alan Wallace for Columbia University Press. Now, I will say a few words about the actual arena where there is an active collaboration. So from the wider societal point of view, perhaps the most fruitful aspect of this ongoing dialogue between Buddhism and science has been the emergence of genuine collaboration between scientists and Buddhist scholars in some practical domains. Today there is in fact an emerging field often referred to as, I mentioned earlier, contemplative science, or the science of meditation. At this stage, it is not clear what such a field would look like, or whether it will have any lasting impact on science as a whole. On the part of science, participants in this new field include neuroscientists, psychologists, and clinical researchers. The neuroscientists and psychologists are on the whole interested in engaging with Buddhist Abhidharma, psychology and phenomenology, as well as Buddhist contemplative practices to see if the research methods and the theoretical framework on the study of the human mind could be enriched through serious engagement with Buddhist thought. The clinical researchers, on the other hand, are principally interested in testing the effects of specific contemplative practices, such as mindfulness, loving-kindness, compassion cultivation practices, in health-related, on the basis of, in relation to health-related outcome measures. There is also the more basic question of whether, through experiments on the Buddhist ethics, science can learn something about the potential and the capacity of the human mind, which it hasn't even considered. Today, several pioneering experiments and collaborative studies are underway in the various universities, especially in the States, and I've been part of, involved in one of those joint ventures, if we can call it. On the methodological side, today some scientists and philosophers of science are seriously exploring the possibility of bringing introspection back into psychology. Introspection is the first person observations of the content of one's own mind. In the West, it has very bad reputation. It was used once and then it was completely rejected, and behaviorism triumphed for many decades. But now there is a call for bringing it back into the picture. The understanding here is that unless we introduce some form of first-person approach, we will have no handle on capturing the first-person subjective nature of our experience of consciousness, which is in fact its defining characteristic as well. I mean, those who are familiar with the literature will know a very influential paper written in the 1970s by a philosopher, Thomas Nagel, which was entitled, "What Does It Feel Like to Be a Bat?" So the point here is, how can we get a conceptual handle on what we call consciousness, whose primary defining characteristic is the subjectivity. So, and that paper was very influential. So, and in some sense, modern psychology does use introspection. They call it first-person report, self-reports. Of course, how that is accessed gets very complicated, so I'm not going to go into that. So it is hoped that with integration of contemplative methods developed and refined in Buddhism, perhaps a way can be found to employ a more reliable and trained form of introspection. Because one of the big problems of introspection historically has been its total unreliability. If I, intuit, observe the content of my mind, own mental states, and compare it against someone else, and come up with a completely, opposed account, there is no way of adjudicating whose is the right one. So that was a problem. How this incorporation might pan out, only time can tell. And there is, of course, one of the pioneering works in this has been done by the late scientist Francisco Varela. And today his work, what is referred to as the neurophenomenology, is being carried further by a philosopher of science, Evan Thompson, at Toronto. So there is quite a sophisticated discourse that is going on in how we can bring this introspection in a much more refined form so that we can actually use it. One possibly fruitful area of research, as of now yet to be explored, is the rigorous work on the Buddhist Abhidhamma taxonomy of mental states, where each of these distinct mental states are defined with their characteristics and effects identified. So there is, at least the resources, the potential is there. Inevitably, whether there is, so that now I will say a few words about the impact of this dialogue. So far I've been talking mostly about the impact from Buddhism's encounter with science on the Buddhist institution. Now the possible impact on science from this encounter. Inevitably, whenever there is a serious encounter between two cultures, both sides are transformed. The question is, in what ways might science, or more specifically, the scientific worldview, change through this encounter with Buddhism? There is, of course, the obvious case of individual scientists personally undergoing change as a result of encounter with Buddhism, especially through a powerful representative like the Dalai Lama. For instance, today we see, discernible impacts on the current work of the noted emotion scientist Paul Ekman in the light of his engagement with Buddhist thought. By the way, there is a beautiful book that has just come out based on his series of conversations on emotion regulation with his Holiness. We see similar influence in the work of the well-known neuroscientist Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin. And Davidson, in fact, Dr. Davidson has just recently established a new center called the Center for the Creation of a Healthy Mind. Then we also see influences on the later works of the physicist David Finkelstein and the astrophysicist Pete Hutt. So we see influences at the level of individual scientists. On the domain of philosophy of science, we see perhaps the most interesting work being done by people like Owen Flanagan of Duke University, who just came out with a book called The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World, where he brings Buddhism into this debate. Then we have the works of Evan Thompson of York University, Toronto, and Michel Bitbol in Paris, and so on. All these individuals have participated in conversations with the Dalai Lama and were able to see not only the intellectual rigor the Buddhist tradition brings to the table, but perhaps more importantly, also the genuine openness to critical engagement in a conversation that could enrich both sides. The more interesting and perhaps the difficult question is how science as a culture might change through this interaction. For once, science is encountering an intellectual tradition that traces its lineage back to more than 2,000 years of inquiry, yet share a very different history from the rest. Most importantly, this is a tradition where no dichotomous separation between philosophy, religion, and science has ever occurred. So this is an important point that needs to be stressed, because sometimes our tendency is to immediately slot the dialogue between Buddhism and science as part of a religion and science dialogue. But the whole kind of context of the religion and science dialogues is a cultural context where a separation between philosophy, religion, and science has already occurred. Whereas when engaging with Buddhism, you are dealing with an intellectual tradition which has a much greater integrated notion of worldview, where no sharp divisions have occurred. So that's an important fact that needs to be taken into account. So Buddhism is an intellectual tradition that shuns reductionism and emphasizes a more integrated understanding of the world and human existence, where ontology, epistemology, and ethics share a much closer interconnected relations. As the Dalai Lama puts it, quote, "A full human understanding must not only offer a coherent account of reality, our means of apprehending it, and the place of consciousness, but also include clear awareness of how we should act." End of quote. One area where science's encounter with Buddhism could have a lasting effect is in our understanding of the scope and limits of scientific knowledge. Another area where the impact could be felt would be in the ongoing debate on the connection between science and ethics. With the appearance of Buddhism on the block, a new kid, admittedly, science now has the chance to critically engage with an intellectual tradition that has a robust notion of ethics, which is not contingent upon any notion of a transcendent divine law. The fundamental principle, if there is one in Buddhism, ethical principle, is really the imperative of compassion, a genuine wish to elevate suffering of all beings. So this kind of approach to ethics that places compassion at the heart of ethical discernment constantly will challenge science to be mindful of its motivation as well as the wider implication, as it opens up a whole new area of human knowledge. These are then some of the few identifiable areas where the impact on science through its encounter with Buddhism might be felt. So let me conclude with the following plea from the Dalai Lama. Sorry, I keep quoting His Holiness. Even after all these years of working so closely with him, my admiration and respect for the person still remains as fresh and strong as ever. So I'll quote from His Holiness. "My plea is that we bring our spirituality, the full richness and simple wholesomeness of our basic human values to bear upon the course of science and direction of technology in human society. In essence, science and spirituality, though differing in their approaches, share the same end, which is the betterment of humanity. At its best, science is motivated by a quest for understanding to help lead us to a greater flourishing and happiness. In Buddhist language, this kind of science can be described as wisdom grounded in and tempered by compassion." End of quote. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Jinpa has kindly offered to take questions. And if you'd like to, there's a microphone here, or if you care to just project your voice.
I didn't say anything about my own work at Stanford, so if people want to ask questions about that, I'll be very happy to respond. Yes?
You mentioned that there's been some discussion of the role language plays in the construction of reality. And I'm matching that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, with what you were saying at the end about the importance of the sciences being part of cultural change and of Buddhist influencing in that direction. So could you perhaps say a little bit more along the lines of language influencing that?
Well, one of the things that you will notice, for anyone who has taken a kind of a more serious look at the Buddhist, particularly the Tibetan tradition, is that there is an understanding that the world that we experience is to a large extent the world we have constructed. And part of that construction mechanism includes the language, the common language that we all share and participate in. So there is the understanding that there is a kind of a rejection of the naive objectivist or realist position where our perception is thought to mirror a world existing out there. So here, this constructivist, to use the term very loosely, approach to reality plays an important role to really undermine that kind of naive assumption about an objective reality that is totally independent of the conceptual framework that we bring to our experience of the world. So that's a very important part of the Buddhist epistemology, particularly in the way in which Tibetans have inherited and developed it further. One of the points that His Holiness is making, which I think is very important, is to really point out that science as it is defined today is really an empirical discipline, where there is a very strict criteria that defines what constitutes a scientific fact and what constitutes a scientific knowledge. Now, if that is the model that we're going to use, then clearly the suggestion that anything that is, real somehow should fit within that, framework is very limiting. And a part of this is to really question the assumptions underlying the scientific worldview. Not so much science per se, but the assumptions that people make. So, and even on the part of the scientist, sometimes you can see a certain ambivalence. For example, on the one hand, most of the scientists, if you push them, will accept that science is not in the business of proposing values. It's about facts. And they, the scientists on the whole really buy into this human distinction between facts and value. This famous problem of you cannot bring ought out of, infer ought out of is. So most scientists at the intellectual level will kind of subscribe to this position. But at the same time, when they then encounter a worldview that assumes certain different explanatory principles, then they will say this is all bonkers. So, because in some sense there is no, the His Holiness's point is that you cannot have a comprehensive understanding of the world and our existence by having only scientific knowledge as the constitutive element of that understanding. You need to have, human existence include both facts and values and meaning and ethics. So in order to have that kind of integrated worldview, we need to somehow understand the limits of and the scopes of scientific knowledge. And this, I think, is a very powerful challenge. And given that this challenge is coming from intellectual tradition that shares hardly any history with the scientific, thought, that's what is quite interesting. Yes.
I would love for you to talk about your work at Stanford for the Center for Contemplative. I think we all would.
Well, Stanford has a new neuroscience institute called Stanford Institute for Neuro Innovation and Translational Neuroscience. And the center has been established as part of that new institute. And the idea behind the establishment of the center is to really promote a kind of a serious scientific engagement with compassion and altruism and associated mental states. In other words, the important mental states that are crucial for understanding human motivation, particularly the good acts. And and the idea here is to create a center that would promote this study, which will use scientific method as its principal approach, but will, draw from the insights of a multiplicity of disciplines. Because, for example, in a sense, in the study of what philosophers call moral sentiments, which includes compassion, sympathy, and empathy, science is, in a sense, slowly encroaching into a territory that has traditionally been that of Buddhism, but that of religion and philosophy. And one of the roles that I play is to really remind the scientist that they should not act as if the slate is completely clean. There's been a lot of thought gone into this by great minds over a period of thousands of years, both in the West and in the East. So, and especially when scientists use key measurements like fMRI, you see a blob, on the image. Now someone needs to interpret that. And so where the content of that concept is going to come from. So you have to, look somewhere, because, neuroscience is not going to tell you, how does compassion differs from sympathy or empathy, or it's not going to tell you. Someone has to do the conceptual work. And a lot of work has already been done in the contemplative traditions, whether in the East or in the West. For example, if you look at, the Abrahamic tradition, New Testament is particularly very strong when it comes to compassion. And it has this somehow tapped into an approach that can invoke that kind of powerful sentiment in the individual. So clearly they have, the teachings have discovered something. And so, and also the vision of, the human mind's, heart's capacity for self-transcending, sentiments are very powerfully articulated in the world's great traditions. So the point we need to understand, particularly scientists who are engaging in this kind of domain, is to respect the fact that great amount of thought has been spent on this, understanding, human emotions, particularly that motivate good behavior. And so as much as possible, we draw from this multiplicity of disciplines and also encourage, even among the scientists, a kind of a more collaborative and interdisciplinary approach. Because, for example, we find that on the study of empathy and compassion, you have non-human primatologists, primate scientists who are talking about, evidence of empathy in animals. You have economists who are talking about, charitable giving and altruistic behavior. You have a neuroscientist who are talking about, brain mechanisms that underlie, altruistic, behavior. You have psychologists who are talking about, especially developmental psychologists, talking about, evolution of empathy in children. But everybody's using the terms, but they're all using in their own different ways. So phenomena, in the end, phenomena is phenomena, however you describe it. So there needs to be a much greater collaboration, even among the scientists, so that at least there is a consensus on, the key terms that are being defined and the content of these terms and the concepts. So our center at Stanford is really deliberately aimed at promoting this kind of multidisciplinary scientific approach, but that will also take into account of the history of engagement in these fields. So therefore we have representations from both contemplative scholarship and scientists, and also we are interested also in the basic science question of mapping the brain. What systems of the brain are active when this happens, when that happens, and here the role of more experienced Buddhist meditators can be very important, because at least the idea is that they have some degree of control over their own mental processes. Yes.
Were you present at any discussions between Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama?
No, unfortunately, no. I was, at the time I was too young. This was conversations in the 1960s, yeah. But there is actually a whole account of that in Merton's journal, in the Asian journal. He gives a very detailed account of his conversations. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure you're aware of the research that's been started by paranormal psychologists and psychiatrists in the area of trying to collect evidence for rebirth and reincarnation.
Yes.
So my question to you is, do you think it's useful to try to apply a scientific approach to collecting quote-unquote evidence for phenomena that are based, or that would necessitate gathering evidence on these extremely hidden levels of knowing, or that might be outside the purview of material causation? Or do you think that this is a conflict of paradigms that will not result in good information for either side?
Well, it's actually a very difficult and challenging question, although in my presentation I gave this impression that there are certain circumcised parameters within which the discourse takes place, but like everything in life, the edges are very blurred, so you cannot make sharp distinctions. Sharp distinctions are always conceptual kind of boundaries that you create. So the example of the rebirth may be one case in point. Now, to play the devil's advocate, for a skeptic, no matter how many anecdotal evidence you're going to bring, they're always going to have something to say. And for the traditional Buddhists, they will think, why do I need evidence? So it's one of those things, but in the end, from a kind of a philosophical point of view, the real challenge in the end is a conflict between two regulative principles. So on the side of science, the regulative principle is that mind is matter. Mind is brain, and when death occurs, that's the end of your mental processes. On the part of the Buddhists, not just Buddhists, but also many of the classical Indian tradition, the regulative principle is that, mind is not material. So mind is not reducible ultimately to matter. So this is going to be one area where there is going to be irreconcilable differences. But I wouldn't say with science per se, but rather this regulative principle that is part of an assumption of scientific worldview. And the challenge probably is going to be, in the end, on the question of whether or not science will ever be able to have an understanding of consciousness, a comprehensive understanding of consciousness. That's going to be the crux of the matter. Because for Buddhists, consciousness, although as we experience it, is heavily contingent upon, body, but in itself, consciousness is not material. So, and it is defined as luminous nature, and pure, awareness is its defining characteristic, and subjectivity is its nature. Whereas for science, this is not acceptable. And my own feeling on this question is kind of agnostic. If the push comes to the shove, probably I'm more of a mysterious. I don't think science will ever get a full handle on consciousness. There were times when some scientists with hubris thought they have actually got it. Someone wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. And then I wrote a beautiful review of that I think it was London, maybe New Review of Books. And the reviewer said, after critiquing the book, said, actually the author should have called it Consciousness Explained Away, which was basically what it was. He was a behaviorist. And then of course some philosophers have called consciousness the really hard problem. So from the Buddhist point of view, the day there is a fully convincing, comprehensive materialist theory of consciousness, then Buddhists are in trouble. Until that time, I don't think kind of rebirth or any of these probably will, in the end it will hinge on how you define consciousness. So my own feeling is that, the thing is, the way in which scientific concept is formulated as it stands is from the third person objective perspective. But how are you going to get ever a handle on describing a phenomenon whose primary characteristic is a first person subjectivity? Nagel's question, what does it feel like to be a bat? We haven't got a clue. So unless there is a kind of a dramatic, radical shift in the way in which we conceive science and the method that is used, for example, like by bringing introspection in, through a kind of a much more refined, sophisticated understanding of introspection and its application. At this point, I can't even kind of conceptualize what a full scientific, kind of description of a consciousness would be like. So you're right. It is a challenge, and a lot will hinge on that from the Buddhist point of view. Yes.
You mentioned the important role of the philosopher in the dialogue between science and Buddhism. And my question comes from a philosopher's perspective, not me, but Heidegger. And because you talked more about science, but from a more philosophical, epistemological, ontological perspective, Heidegger looked at science from the perspective of the essence of technology. So what, the practical aspect of science does. And he, both in the 30s and the 50s, was worried that the essence of technology ultimately brings in a way of being where we end by relating to things and other beings only in what he called standing reserve, looking at them as something to be ordered and processed. So my question is, in this dialogue between science and Buddhism, how does fare this tendency, coming from science, with the Buddhist importance of compassion, which definitely involves a different way of relating to other beings and even to things? And I actually have a second question, but I'm not sure. Maybe you should go ahead with this, and then...
Well, that's actually a very important question, because one of the things about His Holiness's writings, if you look at it, is to really remind us that how we understand the world and how we view ourselves and our place in the world and how we view others is really going to have a major impact on how we behave and relate to the world. And this is, of course, in a sense, a very Buddhist message as well. And one area where he has particularly kind of done quite a lot of work is to argue for upholding a much more positive conception of human nature, because by formulating a certain conception of human nature, we are in a sense telling our own story. And what kind of story we tell of ourselves as the human species is going to have an impact on how we interact with others. So if we see ourselves as purely self-interested, kind of being whose only interest, concern is the survival and well-being of this discrete, isolated ego, we're going to then be in the world and operate from that principle. So in that sense, Heidegger's writing really represents a very deep insight on the cultural impact of the domination of the scientific. Basically, in other words, it's domination of scientific model as a model of knowledge. So which kind of then judges all other forms of knowledge in relation to science and prioritizes scientific knowledge. And when that happens, and alongside technology, the point he was making is that instrumentality becomes the key feature of the validity of knowledge. What can we use it for? And that is going to have an impact on how we see the world. Of course, Heidegger is one of the most difficult philosophers. My undergraduate training at Cambridge was in philosophy. And of course, Cambridge is not the place for Heidegger, because if you study Heidegger, you have to go to sociology department, actually. So I did do a little bit of Heidegger. I went through this huge book, Being and Time, struggled with Dasein. But one thing that I was very impressed by is his later writings on the effect of science and technology and our understanding of it. Now in Buddhism, you're right, compassion, particularly elevation of compassion as the highest spiritual and ethical value, really acts as a powerful corrective, because it constantly reminds you of why you are doing this, why you are doing this. So even though, as Buddhist philosophers, like any other philosophers, may sometimes get bogged down in minute details of some very esoteric kind of, philosophical question, but in the background there's always this reminder, kind of light, about the primacy of compassion as your motivation. And so as much as possible, if that can be brought into, have some bearing on the direction of science and scientific research, of course the benefits would be very good.